For this video, we are in Pingtung at Heito prisoner of war camp. This camp was opened by the Japanese in 1942 and closed in 1945. And in this camp, many prisoners from Britain, Australia, Canada and America, captured from Indonesia, Singapore and Malaysia, were sent to Taiwan to work in the prison camps all around the island. Since the end of the war, this area has changed dramatically. When prisoners first arrived here, this whole place was an expanse of fields, dusty brown fields, and they were being prepped to harvest sugarcane. And that's what the prisoners of war were tasked to do. They were tasked to go into the fields and clear the ground of stones and rocks, and then ship the rocks off to different places in Taiwan to fortify airfields and military bases. Some of the prisoners were tasked to harvest the sugarcane and work in the huge sugar factory which used to exist in Pingtung County. Behind this wall here would be where all the fields used to be, where the sugarcane was harvested. And that is also where the river is, where the Allied prisoners moved all the rocks and prepared the soil for the harvests of sugarcane. Conditions at this camp were particularly bad. The weather was pretty dire. The workers were in the fields, often without adequate protection, adequate clothing, and they often got sunburned. Some prisoners died from their sunburn, the sunburn being so serious that they died of blood poisoning. Aside from the long working hours and the terrible working conditions, many of the prisoners were assaulted and mistreated by the prison camp guards. While the more healthy and stronger prisoners went out to work in the fields, many of the weaker or ill prisoners were made to work in the gardens on the camp, raising chickens or growing crops. Unfortunately, many of the crops and much of the meat and chickens never saw the prisoners' mouths, instead going to the Japanese guards and the Taiwanese guards. We should perhaps just take a moment to consider the intense working conditions which the prisoners of war would have had to have endured. It's only March, the end of March now, and the weather is already really, really hot. But in the summer, the tropical sun would have beaten down in southern Pingtung, and it would have been terrible for the prisoners to work outside and engage in manual labour. During the 3 years that this prison camp was open, over 1,160 prisoners were interred in this camp, and unfortunately over 130 of them died. After the war, the KMT took over this camp and made a military base on the site. Most of the old buildings were knocked down and new buildings put in their place. However, some of the old huts still exist, and this one I'm in here was one of the old accommodation huts which the Allied soldiers would have lived in throughout their time during their stay at this camp. Now these huts are extremely dilapidated, and the elements have really taken the toll on the wooden structures. When the prisoners first arrived here in 1942, most of the huts were made of bamboo with thatched roofs, but over time the huts were turned into wooden huts with wooden slats, and of course the slate roof was added at a later date, probably after the war. These huts are identifiable by these struts that come out to support the walls here. It's unfortunate that the weather and the elements have taken their toll on these buildings. These huts are now very dilapidated, and no attempt at preservation has been made. It's a shame really, because it would be nice to see these huts restored to some extent as a tribute and memory to the men who were imprisoned here during the war. The camp closed in 1945, but before the end of the war. It was in 1945 that the US Air Force bombed this camp, and over 20 prisoners of war and camp guards died during the bombing raid. Because of the severity of the bombing raid and the fact that the camp was mostly destroyed, the prisoners were transferred to camps in the north of Taiwan to last out their time. Now, unfortunately, most of the camp has disappeared. It's turned into a military base, which means most of the buildings have been knocked down and there's not much to show you. But we're going to meet the last remaining prisoner of war camp guard that served in this camp during World War II under Japanese occupation. And he's 100 years old. Mr. Yang, it's an honor and a privilege to interview you today, and thank you very much for spending the time to sit with us. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Mr. Yang, can I ask you, at what age did you join the military here in Taiwan?
就是我在台湾忘记了。
忘記啦，20歲，20歲。
太久了，啊
20歲啦。
你都100啊
20吧。
100啊。
So this is you in the picture here, and you look very young.
幾萬年啦？
In your 20s, is that
Yeah,
safe to say?
maybe 20.
In the 20s.
24 or
Okay.
23.
Being 100 years old, it was clear that Mr. Yang was having difficulty recalling some of the events during World War II, as is totally understandable. Still, it was obvious that throughout his life, Mr. Yang passed on some of his stories to his daughter, Lily.
How many years did he serve in the army?
Maybe 4 years.
4 years. 4 years.
2 years in Linor, 2 years in the Jingguasi.
Jingguasi. Could Mr. Yang tell me what the conditions were like at the camp? How were the conditions?
打住，
More than 100 people.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's quite a small camp,
Yeah.
is that right?
Not the small, it's the bigger.
It's a big camp.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. It's a story about a watch. I think a prisoner gave you a watch.
这个都贵的，伊都便宜啊，都便宜啊。
Maybe it's the memory, so still remember it.
Right. Has your father ever told you of a time where he has been in trouble for helping prisoners when he shouldn't have helped prisoners?
战俘 he doesn't get enough the food. He always take some food for them.
And he gave it secretly to them.
Yeah.
I see.
Even the fruit, even the because that time is not enough the food.
Can Mr. Yang remember a time when he punished a fellow prison guard for treating the prisoners badly?
So my father is the nice guy. Called someone is the strong man is the punished another one.
I see.
Yeah.
So he asked somebody else to punish.
Yeah.
Okay.
Not him, because he just asked someone.
都能把事情搞回来，算久的，
So long time, I forgot.
So around here, there's the prison camp. There are towers. There are bunkers from the Japanese time. How did your father feel about protecting these memorials of World War II?
This year and last year, Before he every day came here, but the inside is always doing. No one protect them.
Okay.
So I feel the sad. He always say something, have the wish.
I see. Like a memorial
but the government didn't do anything. Foreign country Poland have some 集中营.
Right, so they have a memorial to the soldiers and the prisoners there. Right.
So someone came here. The war is so terrible.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mr. Yang was conscripted by the Japanese military in Taiwan and was sent to Heito camp in Pingtung County to serve as a camp guard. How did your father feel when the Japanese left Taiwan after the war and he was able to be free and Taiwanese again? How did he feel?
Maybe feel happy.
Yeah.
They can go home.
Right.
Can home together with the family member.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he started a business, is that correct?
He sell the clothes, buy the banana. Is the exporter to the Japan.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Okay.
He is have the business.
Business mind.
So he based our 9th child.
Right.
So we get the good life and educated.
So after the Japanese left Taiwan, the Kuomintang came to Taiwan. So did he feel that the Japanese were better rulers, or did he feel that the KMT were better for Taiwan?
He think that the Japanese is a much better KMT.
Right. Okay. He had more respect for the Japanese than the KMT.
It's the generation always say that.
And did he speak Japanese?
Yeah, he can
still?
say
Still understand.
One day the Japanese, their next generation came here. He talked with them to say the Japanese.
Very nice to interview both of you.
Yeah, welcome.
And understand Mr. Yang can't speak very well, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Yang, thank you very much.
Thank you, Nicole, thank you.
Mr. Yang was obviously very happy to see us. However, it must have been quite frustrating not being able to recite experiences and memories. Mr. Yang remembers the bombing of the camp by American forces in 1945, where many prisoners and guards were killed. Mr. Yang particularly remembers that a fellow Taiwanese camp guard who stuck his head out over the wall he was hiding behind had his head blown off by shrapnel.
Now, aside from the Japanese prisoner of war camp we've just been to, there's this large 3-story gun tower. And this would have been used to ward off an advancing enemy infantry. This tower is about 3 stories high and would have housed several machine gun emplacements and an anti-aircraft gun. It's been left, it's a protected site, and it's quite imposing. And you can imagine the formidable firepower it would have rained down upon an advancing army.
It would have had commanding views across the plains, the airfield, and towards the ocean.
Another fascinating piece of Japanese World War II infrastructure are these tunnels behind me here. Now, towards the end of the war, the Japanese were getting desperate. They didn't have any aircraft left to do kamikaze missions against the American fleets, so they came up with the idea of kamikaze boats. Now, these tunnels here are for hiding the boats that they would have used to go out to the fleets and detonate charges next to the bows of the Allied ships. And here we're standing in what would have been a pool where the boats would have been housed. The boats would have been placed here, and the ocean is about 200 or 300 feet behind me. So these tunnels here are bunkers for the boats, and over there is a tunnel which would have taken the boat from here, this pool, all the way to the ocean to launch an attack on the fleet. Let's go and take a look at the tunnel. You can see here, these trees would have been here, so they would have camouflaged where the boats were. Of course, the tunnel serves as a sneaky way to get the boats to the ocean and also hide them from Allied aircraft as they're flying overhead. So it would have been a boat, well, several boats packed with high explosives. So I'm not really sure whether the boats were whether the explosives on the boat were manually triggered or not. So when the boats went out, it was a two-man crew. And of course, the soldiers on the boats, they would have lost their lives on an attack on a fleet coming in to invade Taiwan. That's probably a drainage channel which added water to this slipway here. There's a bit of an angle on the slipway. It's a bit like a log flume at an amusement park, but obviously far more serious.
Near to the tunnels would have been a small military unit, situated on top of some steps which still exist today.
So I'm not sure at the end whether it's blocked off at the ocean or not. But we're going to find out in a couple of minutes.
Near the steps is the base of a flagstaff where a ceremony would have taken place before sending the two-man crews to almost certain death.
So coming through the tunnels there, it's amazing to think that the last thing the Japanese soldiers would have seen is the tunnel, and then the sea, and then the fleet coming over the horizon, the last few minutes of their lives. Luckily, it never came to that. The boats were never used, and the war ended before the kamikaze boats were ever put to use. Today's been a fascinating day for me. It was a great opportunity to meet Mr. Yang, and although he didn't say very much because of his age and because of memory loss and communication problems, it was still great to get a sense and a feeling of the emotions and the experiences he went through as a prison guard in the camp at Heito in Pingtung County. And that just leaves me to, well, Michael's going to bring it over for me. Thank you, Michael. Anybody who has any interest in World War II and also the prison camps and the conditions in Taiwan during, between 1942 and 1945 should really get this book. It's called Never Forgotten, and it's written by Michael D. Hurst. It's very well researched and extremely informative. Anybody with an interest in World War II and the history of World War II in Taiwan and the prison camps should really get their hands on this book. It's well worth a read. Thanks very much for watching and joining us on this Trax video.